please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Dr. Amy Sherman.
Thank you, Josh. Well, good morning to all of you. It is a pleasure to be here with you guys. So I read a novel some months ago, and it actually has a lot about art in it, and it's a book that maybe some of you know of. It's called Theo of Golden. It's kind of making the rounds right now. And I'm not going to spoil the plot in case you haven't read it yet, but suffice to say that the protagonist, an older gentleman named Theo, one of the things that happens in the books is that he buys a number of very finely crafted portraits from a local artist, and he ends up befriending this local artist, and they end up having these really rich conversations, including a conversation around a question that a lot of folks ask, which is, what is good art? And there's a point in the novel where he says this. Theo kind of is reflecting on this, what is good art? And he says, for anything to be good, truly good, there must be love in it. I'm not even fully sure what that means, but the older I get, the more I believe it. There must be love for the gift itself, love for the subject being depicted or the story being told, and love for the audience. Whether the art is sculpture, farming, teaching, lawmaking, medicine, music, or raising a child, if love is not in it, at the very heart of it, it might be skillful, marketable, or popular, but I doubt it is truly good. Nothing is what it's supposed to be if love is not at the core. So we're considering this idea of vocation together, this work that we do as we try to contribute to others. And, you know, as believers, we want to understand deeply, well, how should our faith animate and shape and influence this work that we do? And one of the answers to that question has to do with kind of the how of the work, like who we are as the workers. And so part of what it means to sort of connect your faith and your work together has to do with you as the character, your character as the worker, right? We're all trying to pursue Christ. We're all trying to become more like Christ. And so we are trying to become loving workers, right? Kind workers, compassionate workers, diligent workers, honest workers, faithful workers, right? The kind of worker we are matters to God. And that's part of what vocation, that's part of what sort of stewarding your vocation is about. But connecting our faith and our work isn't just an adverbial pursuit, right? It's not just about the kind of people we are, using all sorts of adjectives like kind and faithful and diligent and honest. Faith and work integration is also about the nature of the work itself, the what of the work. And that's what I want to talk about today, the what of the work, because not only does our character as workers matter in this pursuit of vocational faithfulness, but what we actually do matters to God. And so to help us think a little bit about putting love into our work and thinking about the what of our work, I want to use this very familiar text from Ephesians 3 as a sort of organizing framework for the things I want to say today. This is a very familiar text where Paul prays for the disciples in Ephesus that they would have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. High and wide and deep and long, right? These are characteristics or dimensions of the love of Christ. And so I want us to consider together the what of the work of artists and how we might use these four dimensions of the love of Christ as sort of metaphorical guidelines for for putting love into our labors. Because each of these four metaphors, they point us to a way in which good art or good work is a loving response to a particular form of brokenness in our sinful and suffering world. We began the conference talking about being creators, and creation is a huge part of God's big story in the world. But another huge part of the grand biblical narrative is the story of God's loving mission to repair and restore and renew the broken creation, to renew all things, right? People, places, fields, sectors. So exercising faithfulness in and through our daily labors involves creativity, absolutely, and it also involves joining God on this loving mission of repair and renewal. And friends, the arts play a huge role in that. So for those of you professionally as creatives, thank you for the work that you do. All right, so let's dig into these metaphors. The love of God is high and wide and deep and long. So what might the metaphor of high signal for this idea of putting love into our artwork? Well, I think one expression involves how art cultivates awe and wonder in a world where we have sort of lost a sense of mystery, where we have some dulled sensibilities. And this kind of art that lifts us up and nurtures awe and wonder, that's really, really needed today. We have this huge volume of information that we're sort of drowning in. And there's an immediacy about sort of getting answers to questions. But sometimes the very convenience and immediacy of getting answers to the things we wonder about tends to satisfy our curiosity, but it doesn't necessarily enlarge our curiosity. And today, when we kind of encounter beauty, sometimes instead of being captivated by the beauty, it's like we have this cultural impulse to capture the beauty, right? Usually with our cell phone, usually with a selfie, right? We document our experiences more than we inhabit them. And we need to inhabit them in order for them to work on us and produce that kind of awe. And so I found these pictures, and I thought this is really interesting. We got one person who's sort of experiencing wonder and awe as everybody else is on their phone or taking pictures or taking selfies. So in response to some of these sort of broken cultural impulses, we need art that nurtures awe and wonder. It really, really matters. And we've already touched on this a little bit at the summit here. It matters, for one thing, because it fosters curiosity, and it fosters openness. And we need that in a world of very rigid thought patterns and closed-mindedness. As I did research for this talk, I was fascinated to find some information from the American Institute of Medical Education, which has sort of documented this idea that as we experience awe and wonder, it literally physically works on our brain in such a way that we are like primed for greater involvement in curiosity and exploration and learning. It literally does that to our brains. And not only that, but awe can soften our instincts towards excessive self-interest, and David referred to that. There's a psychology professor at UC Berkeley. His name is Dr. Keltner. He wrote a book about awe. Fun fact, he was also the scientific advisor between that absolutely wonderful Pixar film called Inside Out. If you've seen that, he was like the psychologist that was the advisor behind that film. Anyway, he wrote this book about awe, and he talks about how awe can motivate us to see beyond our own desires. And he says, that awe actually, it quiets the voice of the self. it sort of humbles us. And it does that in very healthy ways. And it even humbles us in ways that encourage us to collaborate and share with other people. His book on awe is really quite interesting, the research. So what might some examples of art that kind of nurtures awe and wonder? Well, we could give a million examples of it. For me personally, I enjoy some fantasy literature, stories that kind of take me out of the world that I know and put me into this wondrous, unfamiliar world that sort of opens up my mind and begins to kind of, blow my mind a bit. And of course, visual arts can also provoke a sense of awe and wonder. These are some pictures from an artist in New York City called Cepha Klein. And in 2023, she had an installation that was called Webs, Where Everything Belongs. And what she was doing in her art was reflecting on just the amazing and wondrous interconnectedness of creation. And in an interview with CNN after the show, she said this. She said, "Awe is seeing that you are exceeded by something else and finding peace and beauty and admiration in that fact." And the "and" there is really important because as we work to kind of cultivate a sense of awe and wonder, there are sort of healthy ways of doing that, and there's some unhealthy ways of doing that. Amy Leach is a writer. She wrote a book called The Salt of the Universe, and she contrasts these two experiences in her life that help us get at this. She says, she talks about how she grew up in this really rigidly fundamentalist Seventh-day Adventist church as a child, and she remembers listening to a particular sermon as a child, and she contrasts that with an experience of going to an outdoor concert as an adult in Grant Park in Chicago at night under the stars, listening to Mozart's Requiem. And she says what she remembers about the sermon when she was a teenager was that the preacher kind of showed these ever-expanding, pictures of like a slideshow of the universe. And these are some of her words. The preacher was encouraging his listeners to sit there, quote, simpering, sniveling, embarrassed to have been noticed by someone as enormous as God. And the takeaway Leach heard as a young person was that in attempting to instill awe, this preacher was basically trying to communicate, God is a bigwig and you are a weevil. And she says, by contrast, there she is in Grant Park under the amazing beauty of the stars, listening to this performance of Mozart's Requiem. And she says, quote, somehow the singers did not seem dwarfed, but complemented by the stars. And instead of trashing themselves, they sang, remember, merciful Jesus, that I am the cause of your journey. Well, let's move on to our second metaphor, this idea of art that is wide. What might that mean? Well, for me, part of it, it's an expression of like wide open arms of welcome and invitation in the face of the brokenness of exclusion and the impulse to other. There's this rich, deep biblical theme of welcome and hospitality and invitation that we can nurture in our art. And we need to do that because there's this othering that's going on. This is when we highlight differences between groups of people in order to increase suspicion of them, or to insult them, or to exclude them. And the ugliness of this kind of speech is happening around us, and it's very dangerous speech. Human rights experts, talk about how that kind of othering, it sets the stage for discrimination and persecution. And it's so contrary to the biblical story, right? Biblical Christianity teaches us to meet exclusion with invitation and embrace. Instead of othering the stranger, we're actually called to love the stranger, right? The Greek word for hospitality literally is love of the stranger. So what can this sort of wide dimension look like in art? Well, so many different things. One expression, I think, of this is making marginalized experiences more visible through our art. I love how this French television show does this. It's called Astrid. You can watch it on PBS. And it's this show where one of the main characters is a young woman who's on the autism spectrum, and she is an absolutely brilliant criminologist. And you watch the show, and over time, there's a number of characters that are neurodivergent, and they're bringing their perspectives and their gifts to bear on things. And the show treats this whole thing in such a winsome and loving and funny and respectful way. And you just have this sense of, wow, I'm glad I'm coming to understand and empathize more with a community that's different from me, and I am really seeing their giftedness and their talents. So one expression of wideness in art is making marginalized experiences more visible. I think it can also just look like really good storytelling that showcases in very three-dimensional ways the embodiment of this idea of hospitality. I recently reread Marilyn Robinson's book, Gilead. And if you've read it, you know that there's like themes of hospitality and inclusion and welcome throughout the book. And one of the things it does so well is it showcases the very real difficulties that are involved in showing really graceful hospitality. The main character is an elderly minister named John Ames, and he's had this decades, relationship with his wayward godson, Jack, and Jack has come back to town. And throughout the book, this, humble minister who wants to, love Christ and show love and knows that he's called to this posture of welcoming and invitation and hospitality, but it's hard. But in one passage, he reflects so beautifully on this, and he says, when you encounter another person, when you have dealings with anyone at all, it is as if a question is being put to you. And so you must think, what is the Lord asking me in this moment, in this situation? If you confront insult or antagonism, your first impulse will be to respond in kind. But if you think, as it were, this is an emissary sent from the Lord, and some benefit is intended for me, you are free to act otherwise than as circumstances would seem to dictate. You are freed of the impulse to hate or resent that person. So wideness can take place in our art when we really make hospitality very three-dimensional. And there's a collective of artists in Cincinnati called Botris Gilvin, and they've made this idea of welcome and belonging very granular and concrete because they worked together to create this thing called the Casa Calvina in Cincinnati. And the whole idea is this is a house of welcome for newly arrived Latin American neighbors into the community, celebrating them, celebrating their community and their traditions. All right, let's move on to our last two metaphors, deep and long. And it's actually a little difficult to separate them because they address sort of highly related forms of brokenness, shallowness and reductionism. So what does this metaphor of deep signal for putting love into our art? Simply put, I would say that art that is really good can help us resist the pervasive problem of shallowness in our culture and can actually encourage us to become divers instead of skimmers, right? So much in our culture really nurtures skimming, right? Our interaction with information is often not characterized by depth, but by velocity, right? We're scrolling and swiping and skimming and sampling. And that, as so many people smarter than me have commentated, that kind of shallow engagement is very corrosive in our society, right? Because it's reducing our ability to think critically, it's reducing our ability to empathize deeply, it's reducing our ability to make well-reasoned judgments. But we do it, I do it, you do it, because skimming is easy, it's fast, it's entertaining, it requires very little of us. But we have to remember that the most significant human experiences in trying to learn something new, investing in a relationship, trying to actually grow as a person, right? These sorts of experiences, they require our sustained attention. And when our habits of mind are oriented towards skimming, then we are reducing our capacity for those experiences. And I think that good art and good work addresses that problem effectively when it nurtures diving rather than skimming. Good art has some layers to it that require some excavation, right? Good art reminds us that there's more than what's just at the surface. And Theo of Golden says that good art must incorporate love for those experiencing it, right? The audience. And it is a loving thing when your art requires people to slow down and to pay attention. And your art is loving when its depth kind of forces people to bear down, and it develops these muscles where we become divers instead of skimmers. And really the result is we're growing as people of love, because it's divers, not skimmers, who are actually able to listen long and well to people. It's divers, not skimmers, who are actually able to achieve a genuine understanding of other people, especially people who are different. And it's divers, not skimmers, who authentically weep with those who weep. So what are some examples of depth in art? Well, one is the music of J.S. Bach. And if you've spent any time at all in the world of theology and the arts, you've undoubtedly come across Dr. Jeremy Begbie. And he's written a lot on Bach. And one of the things that he likes to talk about in Bach's work is how it helps listeners to perceive a rich complexity in the apparently simple. And this is the case with the Goldberg variations, because Bach, through that piece of music, gives us 30 different variations on this very gentle and unpretentious little saraband, which is a stately dance. And Begbie explains that you have this sort of simple melody at the beginning, and then there's an hour and a quarter of Bach playing with that and doing all kinds of things with it. And about an hour and a quarter later, the original simple melody is repeated. And what Begbie says is, but now when it's repeated, we can't hear it. We no longer hear it the same way, because now it's replete with all of this diversity and depth. It's gathered all this richness to itself, all these moods and colors. And Begbie says, Bach makes us hear more in what we hear. Now, I know we're not all going to become Bach, right? But still, we can do some work that helps people to hear more in what they hear. Poetry is another means, I think, of cultivating this depth, because poetry pushes us towards a more engaged and active mental processing, right? Not always, but often poetry actually requires more effort than reading prose. Right? In poetry, it's ambiguous. We've got to engage with that. We've got to decode metaphors. We've got to analyze all these different meanings. We've got to figure out, like, where are the connections between things. And we just have to slow down because the meaning isn't just on the surface. There's a gal in my small group from church, and she's a lawyer, and she has always been a really fast reader, and that's really helped her in her career. But some years ago, she was telling the group she made a very intentional decision that she was going to read and memorize a lot of the poetry of T.S. Eliot, because she knew that reading poetry was going to make her a slow reader, and she needed that for the growth of her own soul. And great poetry not only stimulates sort of deeper mental engagement, but it also gets us down into our hearts. And I love Eugene Peterson. Poets train our minds to hear stuff we didn't hear before. Poets tell us what our eyes, blurred with too much gawking and our ears dulled with too much chatter, miss around us and within us. Poets use words to drag us into the depth of reality itself. Poetry grabs us by the jugular, far from being cosmetic language, surface. It is intestinal. It is deep. Well, let's move on to our final metaphor about long. What might this metaphor of long signal for putting love into our art? I would suggest that it means crafting art that helps point us to the uncontainability of God, to the endless measures of his wisdom, and to the concept of eternity in the face of our culture's short-term reductionistic tendencies. So there's these two problems, shallowness, which we just talked about, and reductionism, and they're quite similar, but they're a little different too. Shallowness has to do with depth, right? Just skimming at the top of the surface and not going deep. Reductionism is concerned with scope and explanation. It's when you take things that are really complex and complicated and you try to reduce them down to a single explanation. It's a cast of mind that tends to think that there's only one way to explain everything. And drawing on the work of Begbie and also Ian McGilchrist, who was mentioned by David, the most common form of this is what we call naturalistic reductionism, right? When we're told that the only realities that really matter, that really are realities, are the realities that are amenable to natural sciences. So the naturalistic reductionists say things like, well, the brain is nothing but a computer, and the universe is nothing but subatomic particles. But this cast of mind of reductionism, it happens in other spheres as well. You think about how sometimes in the medical field, persons are reduced to conditions, right? So it's happening in other places. And the arts can provide some resistance to these various forms of reductionism because they help us see and feel that the world can never be captured by one level of explanation. The theologian Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who, as many of you may know, is also an artist, talks of how the artist reminds us that there's always more to what we perceive, right? We're back to David and perception, right? There's always more than what we perceive. The arts are suggestive and elusive, with an A, elusive, right? They remind us that there's always more to the world than what we make of it. And Begbie sort of illustrates this by contrasting Van Gogh's, one of Van Gogh's paintings of peasant shoes with the diagram of shoes that we see on a side of a shoebox when we're at one of those discount shoe stores, right? And Begbie says, when we're looking at the Van Gogh painting, it's drawing us in, right, to all these stories. It speaks of earthiness and hard labor and poverty and making ends meet. There's just all these allusions to this wide array of experiences and narratives. These shoes mean all kinds of things. In fact, the meaning is very, very long. We can't sum it up in a single sentence. It goes on and on and on and on, and it's even different from those who are encountering this particular work of beauty. There's such a length to it because the meaning goes on. And that's why people can sit in an art gallery and stare at this painting for a very long time. But now if you contrast that with the picture of a pair of shoes on the shoebox, the whole point of the diagram is just about getting the correct shoe in the desired size. And unless you hang out with really weird people at discount shoe stores, they're not standing around gazing at the shoebox saying, "Oh my God, I could just sit here looking at this forever. It's just speaking to me in so many ways." That's not what happens, right? Good art, Begbie says, they give expression to a metaphorical way of perceiving the world, a bodily, emotionally charged outlook, which reminds us that there's always more to the world than we can name, control, and grasp. And we badly need to recover this today because our culture has too easily assumed that truth is accessed solely and supremely through a particular kind of naming language which tries to pin things down, or in the words of yesterday, in left brain rather than right brain. Well, let me conclude. I said at the outset that God is on a loving mission to repair and renew all things. And I'm sure I don't have to remind you of the many ways that our world is broken, including some of the examples I tried to share. Because so many of you are artists, I'm sure you are familiar with the Japanese art tradition of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. What I love about this is there's a way in which we can say this is a form of artwork which literally puts gold into the fractures. It puts gold into the breaches. And in the process, it brings about not only repair, but renewal and beauty. And that's what we all have the opportunity to do in and through our work. I've talked about some ways that artists can do that. But the reality is that all of us, whether your vocational field is art or something else, we can do lovingly labors that help spur repair and labors that help spur renewal. That's a big part of what vocational faithfulness looks like, because we are trying to creatively put love into the fractures. So may the Lord, who has poured out his great love into all of our many fractures, with love that is wide and high and deep and long, may that equip and inspire us on each of our own vocational missions. Thank you.